So my background is in speculative design, and what I do is I make a lot of sculptures that are sort of to do with the future of biomedical and healthcare technologies and their sort of ethical and social implications. So I'm not only interested in reality, but also sort of realism and the way that there's this sort of hazy line now between natural and artifice that goes on in the body. So we sort of include a lot of stuff into our bodies that we aren't born with, and I find dentistry is quite an amazing example of this. And this has sort of become the norm within sort of medical design. But often what I do is I look at trying to make sort of quite realistic sculptures to try and convince an audience that perhaps they can believe in alternative realities or alternative sort of perhaps medical scenarios. So I often take a lot of inspiration from things like historical procedures, present procedures, and sort of futuristic procedures that all mainly to do with things like looking at the fabric of the body as a sort of design material. So for example, these amazing sort of Victorian illustrations of rhinoplasty surgery sort of encourage us to think of the body as a site for material generation. So this is an image of quite a famous surgeon called Harold Gillier's work, and he came up with some amazing sort of ways of designing or accessing more material for the body. And although, this is quite a sort of disgusting image. If you've all seen Tom Six's talk, though, it's, I felt not as bad putting this sort of stuff in. But it's really odd because this is sort of real. He did a lot of work on soldiers who'd sort of lost parts of their face due to exposure to bombs, etc. So what he did was he would cut areas of the skin and allow area underneath to sort of heal and make the skin into a sort of tube. And even though this is a surgical procedure, I feel like this is quite similar to sculpting techniques. So essentially what he was doing was making more clay to attach to other areas of the face to sort of build up areas. And if you think about this as a sort of using the natural body's process it for things like healing and adaptation, you start to see that these sort of procedures are quite normal within medicine. And I find it really interesting the way these things are kind of represented. So I often show this video of, this is of maxillofacial surgery. And it kind of makes it look so easy, we are capable of growing and changing, but this kind of just like, oh, look, you just cut here, shove a bit of metal in here, put a few screws in, and then you've got like this totally different face shape. But actually, this is like quite a seriously mega procedure to go through. And as you can see, it's just sort of altering the form of the face. So I sort of, in a way, try and extend this to perhaps a more design reality. So in a way, if you could utilize these surgical methodologies for design purposes, then what sort of alterations might you make to your face? What might the purposes be for doing this, and what are the sort of implications? So this is me sort of wearing some grotesque prosthetics, imagining what it would be like if my face was more aerodynamic. And often I sort of look at these materials in perhaps a similar way to things like companies look at utilizing materials. So what's the logistical best way of sort of using this fabric? And this was a project in which I looked at just that. I sort of started to think, well, logistically, if we were to modify ourselves when you're babies, that's probably the best time to do so because you're at your most soft and you're most malleable. So this project sort of looked at things that parents might do to help their child sort of later on in life. So through things like environmental or social or even perhaps technological sort of pressures. So this baby, for example, was the sort of first one. It had an aerodynamic face. Perhaps it could be used for better travel. This baby has a higher head surface area, so almost like elephant ears. Perhaps the sort of blood vessels might grow closer to the surface, allowing it to sort of get rid of heat quicker. This baby has larger cheeks. So it might be able to absorb more caffeine and work for longer hours and earn a lot more money. then this baby, if it lived in an area with high pollution, might be more likely to suffer from something like asthma. So could you remove a toe, allowing it to contract something like hookworm, which is a parasite that could potentially diminish allergies? And then finally, this baby, which people often find the most gross looking, would it be better to have like a new orifice in a sort of low fatty area in order to absorb drugs like insulin if you suffered from something like diabetes? So these are all almost like a sort of enforced evolution through surgical procedures. And this project has really sort of stuck with me, not only because people often find the imagery quite sort of disturbing, as well as, I'm told, the thought process involved, but in a way, I think the reason why I've got so much out of this project is that it is really odd thinking that the decision that the parents make could have this massive impact on the child's life and their sort of very innocent body. But really, this project isn't that far from reality. So historically and actually currently, we still are modifying our children quite a lot to give them perhaps a better chance of survival. And in a way, I like to think of this as a sort of weighing up of, for better or for worse. Would you be happier to maybe sort of perhaps lose some of your child's brain mass in order to create a higher shaped head, sort of aesthetically? Or again, would you be happy to sort of justify losing some of your child's cheek elasticity to like make up for monetary gains? And in a way, I think these kind of projects are almost on the verge of things like scientific hoax. So I've had a lot of emails from people going like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you've done this." And I'm like, "Oh no, I haven't done it." I'm wondering whether we should, or should we be asking the questions about where the funding for this kind of research is going. And what's sort of interesting, again, about the baby project is that all the procedures are based on surgical procedures that we use now. So this isn't sort of designed for a distant future. This could actually happen tomorrow. And I find this idea of sort of scientific hoax really sort of brings together that what we think of as a sort of crevice between sort of scientific fact and scientific fiction. So Santilli's famous alien autopsy video, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen online, was quite an amazing example of this because it's sort of very shrouded in mystery. So even though the body of the alien, and I would suggest watching this on YouTube if you haven't already, but the body of the alien is made by a quite famous prop designer, but Santilli, the guy who produced this film, still is really adamant that some of the scenes are actually taken from original footage that he found. And whether this is sort of believable or not, I don't want to be sort of very cheesy and quote X-Files, but I really want to believe. And I think this is sort of like quite a worldwide phenomenon, this hope that we can believe in alternative futures. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Fiji mermaid, which there have been quite a few of them made worldwide, and often people will find them on beaches and stuff like that. And I like this sort of idea of a worldwide art project or hoax. And the reason why I'm showing you this today is that recently the Horniman Museum in London received funding to scan the Fiji mermaid. So the Fiji mermaid is essentially half monkey, half fish. And someone found it on the shore of a beach and thought like, "Oh my God, mermaids are real." And since then, we've thought, oh, well, this is half monkey, half fish. Someone's just sewn these things together. But what I found really interesting in the fact that this museum received funding to scan it, that I was kind of hoping that part of the research team deep down might sort of think, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should actually scan it just in case we found another species and we've just disregarded it as a hoax, which actually happened with the duck-billed platypus. I'm not sure if any of you know. So people sort of found the duck-billed platypus and thought, like, this is the weirdest thing. It can't possibly be real. Yeah, of course, they found a lot of wiring in it, unfortunately. But as you know, as a lot of people sort of theorize, a lot of these scientific sort of ideas that are used a lot in everyday life have quite often stemmed from things like popular entertainment. So, you know, a lot of people say iPods and iPads and all those other things are sort of like found in films a lot before they were sort of utilised in everyday life. And things like physics experiments used to be shown at magic shows for sort of entertainment, but also one of my favourite examples is the fact that sort of incubation technology was first trialled at a theme park. So Coney Island theme park first had all these premature babies which they put on show, which I find really weird that they sort of had this disbelief that they might be able to do anything for these children, and the only way they could access funding to undertake this research was to get it through entertainment sort of purposes. So if you think now about how other sort of biomedical technologies are coming about, so things like xenotransplantation, you know, genetic engineering, synthetic biology, bioprinting, etc. I start to sort of think about how might these technologies fit into everyday life and how might we respond to them. So this is a project I did a little while ago about parasitic prosthesis. And the idea behind this project was that I was looking a lot at orchiectomy patients, so people who often suffer from testicular cancer have to have a testicle removed. And what they do is they decide to often have a prosthetic put in there that replaces things like the tactile sensation or aesthetics of the removal of this body part. But unfortunately, obviously, if you put on a prosthetic, it doesn't offer the same sort of hormones that come along with the use of that body part. So I started trying to imagine, well, if you could modify a creature that could replace this part both aesthetically and sort of, more logistically in terms of hormones and what your body actually needs, then perhaps this would be sort of a better way of going about producing prosthetics. But more importantly, how would we be happy to live alongside this sort of living piece of design? You know, would we keep it on our bedside table at night? And this was sort of shown in a one-day exhibition in London in an old hotel. And I was really sort of interested because a lot of people in the audience entered the room and saw the person in bed and then shut the door. And I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe they thought they'd actually walked in on someone sort of in this situation, but I think they might have just thought, oh, this is a bit weird, let's shut the door. Often I think that this idea of playing with reality and imagination is really quite an important tool for designers to perhaps raise worthy or important questions regarding the future, and particularly, in my case, the future of the body. So what I often do is try and make visualizations that perhaps a public audience might believe is real, and perhaps, hopefully, even a professional audience, so someone who might work within the particular subject that I'm looking at. So this is a film of a surgical procedure that I made in 2013, and it was made in the onset of bioprinting. So bioprinting, as I'm sure a lot of you know now, is a technology where you can print cells, human cells or animal cells in different structures to form sort of 3D objects. And so for this project, I designed 3 organs that were all sort of utilising different things from animals and humans sort of put together to create new functions that it might take evolution sort of millions of years to create. So the one that you just saw in the video was essentially like a biological defibrillator. It contains cells from an electric eel in order to create a voltage, which an eel actually can, that's high enough to shock the human heart back into its normal beating pattern. Then the second one was an organ that might prevent you from having a stroke. So this has a sort of little pouch of osmotic cells, and these cells expand due to liquid pressure. And it's also got a salivary gland from a leech. And the idea is that it could produce a blood thinner that might thin the blood and prevent you having a stroke if you're prone to that. And then finally, an organ that would hopefully prevent the sort of symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So with cystic fibrosis, you produce a lot of mucus along your trachea. So if this could sit on top of your trachea and vibrate to sort of dislodge the mucus through your digestive system. But what I found really interesting in the sort of aftermath of this project that was made while I was doing my MA was that the sort of main criticism I received from producing the work was not the fact that it was completely fictional, but rather that the gloves that the people in the film are wearing weren't tight enough. So I found it really funny that for a subsection of the audience, that completely ruined the facade of believing in this alternative reality, even though, you know, my surgical team just consisted of like-minded designers and a few shots of sort of my friends and family poking around. Steph in the background, unfortunately, lying under a table for a really long time, making it look like a heart was beating. So this sort of choreographing this kind of surgery that was based on reality was actually sort of much harder than I thought. And I think really you're sort of under the spell of the audience's empathy in a way. It's really important to sort of play on that. And I think for what I was trying to do was try and create a scenario where the audience could perhaps think, oh, what would it be like to be the patient or the doctor in this sort of alternative reality? So what I've been working on more recently is looking at brain modification. And modification in the brain is quite an amazing thing, because if you think, you know, a tiny alteration can have a massive effect on your behavior, etc. And I made these sort of tests for a robot for a conference a little while ago, looking at how I might be able to encourage empathy in an audience. So I wanted to see if I could encourage people to feel regret when interacting with this robot. So what it does is, if you shout at it, it frowns. And then if you shout at it really loudly, it starts to cry. And then if you shout at it really, really loudly, it gets a nosebleed. So this idea of sort of adding fluidity or moisture as a way of sort of encouraging an empathetic response within the audience. So this project actually weirdly led on to some questions, which luckily I got funding to sort of try and answer as part of a project that was funded by the BioArt and Design Awards. So I worked with two neuroscientists who work a lot with behaviour, Marcel de Jeu and Jos van de Geest, who are based at Erasmus MC Rotterdam, as well as sort of quite an eclectic group of other people. So Christos Milidis, who's a roboticist, Jack McKay-Fletcher, a computational neuroscientist, Sean Clark, a composer, Marcel Helmer, another designer, Vaibhav Tyagi, a neuroscientist. So there was this like weird group of people who were sort of put together in order to create this piece of artwork. So our intent was to make a fluid sculpture of my brain. So what people are trying to do with things like the Human Connectome project, which I'm not sure you've heard about, but basically they're trying to make an atlas of the whole brain. But essentially I found this quite interesting because your brain is never really static. You know, as soon as you're learning things, while I'm talking to you now, I'm creating other connections, and my brain and body is forever in this sort of state of flux. So what we did was we scanned my head and translated the data into this sort of floating representation of my brain. So what we did is I went to Erasmus, and this is me with Joss, just before I went in the MRI scanner, to have my brain scanned, and we ended up with these sort of very beautiful cross-section images that I'm sure you're used to seeing of brains, but it was quite odd seeing my own brain. And then we used this information in order to have a look at where roughly the connections lie in my head, hoping to sort of utilize this information to generate an artificial neural network, which was based on my own brain data. And then what we did was we wanted to translate this data into a machine. So we thought we'd utilize a drone. And I know drones are very popular right now, but I think it's sort of this quite romantic idea that your ideas could somehow be floating somewhere distant from your body. It's sort of in the air above your head. So we took these connections that spanned sort of across the 3D structure of my brain and created nodes that we could use to create this artificial neural network. And this is a sort of simplified version. So the network itself contained around 720 nodes, and each connection would basically strengthen and weaken dependent on the decision the drone had made. So essentially what we were hoping is from the beginning of the exhibition, which would have started from when my scan data was taken to the end, we might be able to create this sort of fluid structure of how my brain actually works and makes decisions. But as I said, sort of trying to dabble in another discipline with such a short period of time is quite impossible, and also trying to create this sort of quite complex machine. And it was sort of really helpful trying to collaborate with people who deal with these kind of modeling processes on an everyday basis. So Jack and Christos were extremely helpful in helping me to sort of understand how modeling the brain in a computer is very different to modeling the brain out of clay, for example. And so what we kind of wanted to do was to question these sort of modeling techniques and whether this drone in any way could be replicative of sort of the complex structure of the human mind, or the complex rhetoric of the human mind. And so we ended up with this very slow-moving sort of machine that would sort of float around the gallery space. And it was really odd because I thought, because I was involved in the production, I wouldn't ever feel that idea of uncanniness towards this machine, even though it was essentially a sort of self-portrait. But what happened is, while we were setting up sort of manically for the show, Jack and Christos came to the Netherlands in order to help sort of put it in the space in Gallery Mu in Rotterdam. And what happened was it sort of started moving towards the wall, and we all got really worried because it's sort of made of fabric and it's quite fragile. So we all sort of ran towards it to stop it hitting the wall. And then Christos was like, oh, wait, it's got to learn to avoid the wall. And I found it really weird because I was suddenly like, oh my God, this piece of fabric, fabric and electronics is suddenly, I feel suddenly sort of a bit sorry for it, or a bit somehow connected to it. And it became anthropomorphized. I think that's a word, in that sort of short amount of time, just by Christos sort of highlighting that. And so what I suppose I'm trying to get at is that this idea that we create these sort of alternative scenarios is often very reliant on our ability to sort of project our own reality onto artwork. So we project things like our experience or our empathy, and that sort of can really lead to the success of whether we believe this thing is real or not. And I often look at things like healthcare procedures and how I come up with ideas. And I suppose in the art and design world, we might call it speculation. So we come up with ideas trying to expand reality or stretch reality. But I suppose in the healthcare world, this is kind of just called hypotheses. So this sort of happens over a broad range of disciplines, but just in a very slightly different way. And then I sort of started to look at things that we've done in the past and things that we're perhaps going to do. So, if we're not putting people in walls for some reason, or, shooting them with lasers, or creating odd eye scissors. I found a lot of these strange examples to choose from to show you today. Then we're going to be doing things like putting human cells into other animals, doing things like de-mummifying corpses, or even swapping heads. And sometimes I think, you literally cannot make this stuff up. So thank you so much for listening. Cheers.